There we go.
All right, there you go, everybody. Welcome. All right, welcome everybody to August 11th, 2022. Our Twin Cities guest speaker is Brandi Olson, who lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. Welcome, Brandi.
Hello.
If you don't know Brandi, hopefully you'll get to know a little bit of her today. Brandi is a best-selling author around organizational agility, and she's also the founder of Real Work Done, which is a consultancy group serving leaders through agile transformation, organizational strategy, and team design. She also does executive coaching. She has worked in the coaching industry for quite some time, and with nonprofits to global companies like 3M and the Mayo Clinic, and also for some universities. She's an expert in organizational learning and change, and teaches leaders how to solve problems and adapt fast with high-performing teams. She is a sought-after speaker on agility and high-performing teams, and she has a couple of kids and a dog, and as I said, she lives in St. Paul, and she has just released a new book called Real Flow. How about that?
How about that, man? It sounds nice when you read that out loud. Thank you.
Paraphrase. All right, so Real Flow, is this your first book? No, you got a couple of books out now. Where's that?
This is my first book.
Right.
I've been a lifelong teacher and learner, and writing comes slowly for me. So I took a few years to write this one, but it's my very first book, and it's super exciting to be on this side of it where it's released and people are reading it. And I'm no longer sitting with my laptop in a corner writing by myself or editing by myself. I'm getting to do what I really love, which is to have conversations about how we do good work together.
All right. So just so everybody knows, the format for today is going to be an interview. So Brandi has all these things, they're fresh in her mind. She just got her book out. She's hot on the trail, trying to really help people understand organizational change. And tonight's title is Organizational Change Without Losing Humanity. We thought that would be a really good concept, because a lot of times we forget about the human factor and when we do organizational change. So I'm going to ask Brandi some questions. We're going to let this go into a conversation. If you have a question, you want to follow up, just put it directly into the chat. If you are a little shy and you don't want your name out there, David Nelson, David, raise your hand. Everybody, that's David. Look for his name in the list and send the message directly to him, and he'll make sure the question gets asked. So without further ado, okay, so why did you write this book?
So the book is about what happens when we are part of organizations and we are working in a flood of competing priorities and unlimited work in progress, and how that impacts us as human beings, and why that winds up being so very costly, and what we can do about it instead. And I wrote the book because I was working with teams and organizations who are trying so hard to make really significant changes in their organization and the ways that they work together, and yet still kind of being crushed by this weight of all-consuming important work to do. And well, it's easy to say, like, say no to the things that don't add value, or only do the things that add value. Those should be your number one priority. What I was finding was so many of the teams and organizations that I was working with had done that, right? Like they'd said no to a lot of things, and what they were left with was an abundance of important work to do. It felt like they had to say yes to it all and do it all. And there's a real human cost to that. And so I wrote the book to connect the dots, right, between what happens when we work in a flood of competing priorities and how that impacts us as real people, and then what happens when we have entire organizations of people working together, context switching all day long, and working in ways that are really dehumanizing, and how that builds, right, to some really heavy losses and heavy costs for organizations that are trying to do good work.
Yeah. A lot of us on this phone have been doing transformational work, organizational change work for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And some on this call haven't been doing this for very long. But I just want to say thank you for writing the book, because the people side of change, which is a phrase I'm borrowing from a couple of friends of mine, that it's often overlooked.
Mhm.
And we're so obsessed with all these implementation things and, oh, we're super smart because we know how to do X, Y, and Z. And I just want to say thank you for writing a book about this, because the human side of the human impact, the human side of change is so important. And it's not just capturing change management. There's so much more to that. So when you think about organizational change in the context that you're talking about it, what do you actually mean by that, organizational change?
Right? What does that mean? I have my thoughts on what that means. I would love to hear if anyone wants to throw in the chat. What are some of the things that you think of when we talk about organizational change? Because one of the things that I've learned, and you've probably experienced this too, is when we are engaged in shifting and changing the ways that we're working, we tend to use these words and use them in ways where either we use them and we think we all mean the same thing. And so we use one word and think we all mean the same thing, and come to find out we mean lots of different things when we use that same word, something like organizational change. Or we don't use the same words and it takes us 50 words to explain what we mean and remind each other that we are all talking about the same thing, right? So I think it's super important to have some shared understanding and make some shared definitions of what organizational change really means. Nobody has put in the chat what they think it means yet.
I think the last person to join the video has to answer the question. Bill Ash.
Ooh, drills. 1, 2, 3 video on. You have to, no, you don't have to play video games if you don't want to in Zoom. Okay, so organizational change, structure and policy changing, that's certainly part of it. When you hear that word used in the organizations that you work with, are people usually talking about structure and policy change? What else are people referring to? Like, how does that, what triggers something to rise to the level of organizational change?
Maybe when there's like a new VP or CTO or something that's in charge and they want different people reporting to them or move people further away from them, and maybe they have new policies they want to put into place right away.
Yeah, like we typically hear that word and it often gets associated with like a new leader who's got a lot of power, who wants to change the way everything works. I think, let's see, Lisa, you said layoffs, right? Like a lot of times that word winds up being code for something. And even if you hear, leaders talk about how it's not about that, it winds up being code. Each of us bring to our work a lot of pre-existing knowledge and experience with what change has meant at work and what organizational change means and what change means to us outside of work. And I think that's the first part about organizational change without losing our humanity, is accepting, acknowledging, recognizing that as humans, we just are one whole human self. So how we respond to change, what we think about it, whether it's at work or in our personal lives, like we bring our whole human self, which is our, lifetime of experience, our values, our preferences around what change means and what it brings. And it tends to mean a lot of different things to people, right? When I use that word, what I think about is all the ways that we shift, right, and move from one way of working to another way of working with each other. And how that happens, right, in the context of how we're organized and what we do. But I think it's also like that word change, because it means lots of different things. I think it's helpful to sometimes unpack and talk about what kind of change we mean. And one of the ways that I have found really useful to do that is to borrow actually something from a really brilliant, another Twin Cities author and writer, Glenda Eong. She's the founder of Human Systems Dynamics Institute. Talk about a couple of words that come together to feel a bit jargony, but she's really brilliant. And she talks about the three types of change that exist in groups of people and where groups of people show up. And I think it can be really helpful. So I'm going to offer those as a way to ground our conversation. So one of the kinds of changes she talks about is static change, right? That's one dimensional. We move from point A to point B. If you imagine a group of kids playing soccer, static change is what happens when you kick the ball, the inertia moves it down the field to a different point down the field, point A to point B. And she talks about dynamic change, and that's multidimensional. It's like where there's kind of a couple plays. If you think about that soccer field, dynamic change is what happens when you string together some plays in order to make a goal on the field, right? And so there's a lot of variables that impact where that soccer ball is going to go down the field. You have an intention, you have a plan, but there's a lot of things that can interrupt it. And there's a lot of factors that make it hard to predict all the time with accuracy, like where that ball is going to end up, even if you have a goal for it. A lot of times when we're talking about organizational change, we think that we're dealing with dynamic change, right? Things that are somewhat complicated and complex. But Glenda offers a third type of change. And I think this one is the kind of change that we usually wind up dealing with and we don't always recognize it. And she calls it dynamical change. Dynamical change is what happens if you take that same group of kids who are playing soccer on the field, but instead of having them on a field, they're like a classroom of kindergartners, and you throw 50 soccer balls into the room. And what happens next is entirely unpredictable. It will inevitably be chaotic. And if you stick with it long enough, you'll start to see some patterns emerge. And what emerges will not look the same for that group as it did for the group before. And so when I talk about change, when I think about change, like we need some better words to talk about the kinds of changes that we deal with in organizations. And then we're better equipped to figure out how we show up as humans in the midst of that.
And just as a reminder, if you have a question, you can post it in the chat. If you just can't help it and you gotta just scream it out there, unmute yourself and just give yourself, 10, 15 seconds to get the question out, not a 2-story pre-qualifier or 2-minute pre-qualifier. But feel free to do either one. We want you to feel comfortable asking the questions, jumping in, okay?
Absolutely.
So, wow, okay, so what, get it, totally get it, dynamical. I can't imagine how you throw 50 soccer balls in, let's just say, software development, product development, software development. Mm-hmm. What would those soccer balls be?
Right, what are the kinds of things that create dynamical change? Well, I actually think that like humans often are the thing that create that kind of dynamical change, right? So the more humans you have involved, the more unexpected and dynamical, right? That's Glenda's word. What comes of that is. So you take a change like shifting the way we organize our teams. That's something that many of us have been involved in, right? Especially if you're involved in helping organizations shift the way that they work and the way that they organize teams. Like that can feel on the one hand like a complex change, right? Maybe it's dynamic, but in fact, it's really emergent, right? Dynamical change is emergent, where we can't exactly predict all of the outcomes that will emerge, and it can feel really chaotic. So I actually think that humans are a lot like soccer balls. If we're trying to use that analogy, and the more humans that we have involved, the more variables that come into play. What else? I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. What other kinds of things create that super emergent change that happens, or things that feel really chaotic?
There's a question in the chat. How does the dynamical map to technical adaptive distinction?
Jason, I might need you to say a little bit more what you mean by those words of technical adaptive distinction.
Like complex, complicated, versus complex. So just something a bit more adaptive. I'd heard that distinction before. This seems like it might be presuming and building upon that. I was just trying to get a sense of that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap. And I think that's another lens through which we can look at the kind of change that's happening. Although when I think about like complex and complicated, like that distinction. So we often think about complicated things as having many steps, but the problems have been solved before. So how the pieces go together, right, may have a lot of steps and variable, maybe require a lot of expertise, but it's not really unknown.
Something to do with my hands. I'm not thinking.
When I do that on online school, you yell at me.
Oh, I think
Yeah, but this is.
Yeah,
we might. I think we got some muting challenges.
I did
There we
not
go.
say my wife, but I did.
Okay. So then complex change, right, or complexity is in that space where things are more emergent, right? What emerges maybe hasn't existed before. And I think that's the overlap with dynamic, as Glenda uses that word, right? You think about like the plays that you might move down a soccer field or the complicated parts of a system that you're, putting together. And a lot of times we look at things that we're trying to solve for and we think that they fall in that like dynamic or complicated zone, when in reality, right, it's much more emergent than we realize. And that's where the complexity comes in. And so I think there's a lot of overlap there. Whereas like the other distinction that I make is the language of static or dynamic or dynamical, like describes the nature of the change, the nature of the movement from where we're at now to where we're going to be in the future. And maybe those words like complex or complicated help us understand the solutions or more of the environment too. Maybe those are some other top of mind things. Let's see, there's another, James, yeah, you mentioned the pandemic. And I think that's another one of those things that we all experienced that was like throwing 50 soccer balls into a room full of kindergartners, except we were all the kindergartners and the soccer balls were coming at us from every kind of direction and you didn't know exactly what it was, right? Like if we all think back to those early days of the pandemic, we didn't really know what was going on. We didn't really understand how things were changing. And when we think about organizations, right, like that meant many companies had to figure out how to go totally remote for the first time, right? And they hadn't had to solve that kind of problem before. And while each group of people working together experienced that same kind of life-altering shift in the unfolding pandemic, and how we experienced that initially looked very different. Over time, patterns started to emerge. Patterns emerged at organizations and companies that were very far apart, doing very different kinds of work. And yet the more time that went on, we started to see more similar patterns, right? About ways that we show up to work, ways that we collaborate remotely, ways that we try to solve problems that seemed really impossible to solve initially and then started to emerge. And I think that's really common. Big change like that can feel really chaotic. But there's actually a lot of patterns that help us to understand it and help us to find our ways forward, because we're humans and humans actually behave in some really predictable ways. And humans are actually really good at responding to change, especially when given the opportunity and the environment to do so.
Carrying on with this theme, when you described it earlier, I was like, okay, yeah, the idea of throwing 50 humans at a problem, that is great, I would think, as opposed to let's get 6 people and go in a room and figure it out. As long as those 50 people are smart, hungry, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So people start getting all like, okay, so wait a minute, what if I get 50 people who aren't really going to be good at solving my problem versus 50 people that are good at solving my problem? Where does this where does the humanity start showing up in this, and or how can we behave differently to invite the innovation and foster the humanity? Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, right? And if we bring that question back into like the context of doing work together, a lot of times when organizations decide that change is needed, we need to shift the way we operate from the way we do today to how we want to operate tomorrow. A lot of times there can unintentionally or intentionally emerge this ethos that there's only some people who know what the right change should be or the way things ought to be. And we get some people who decide what the change is going to look like and plan it out, and then they implement it or they execute it or they roll it out. Esther Derby's really good at talking about all of the weird ways we talk about change happening that are really dehumanizing and sound a lot more like we are working with animals or cattle or industry things. So we can tend to create this idea that only some people know what's right or know what's best, or we couldn't possibly let a group of 50 people in on the problem to solve and expect that they're going to come out with a solution. I think that goes right to like a core belief that we can hold or reject about humans and our capacity for being good problem solvers and what kind of space we're given, right? So if you throw 50 people into a room, work together and say, here's the problem we need to solve, and that's all you give them, you're going to have a lot more chaos. It's going to take longer for that group of people to build shared understanding, to make sense of what's happening, to figure out if there's a goal, if they even know what it is, or if they need to decide what the goal is for themselves, to understand what the stakes are there. And so it's going to take them a lot longer to move through that and figure out what the outcome ought to be or what they want it to be. So when it comes to, groups and organizations, having the right environment to tackle those problems makes a huge difference. And understanding how humans actually show up and work and are adaptive can be really useful when we're trying to figure out how do we get, a group of 5,000 people or 20,000 people to work differently together in the future than they do today. Probably throwing all of those people in a room and asking them to solve a problem and come up with a single solution together is going to create that environment that breeds a lot of chaos for a long time. Letting those groups of people understand what the problem is they're trying to solve, right, and the goal, and come up with lots of micro experiments to figure out how to solve the problem would accelerate the learning, and you'd start to see those patterns emerge a lot faster. I think the other thing that makes a difference is a problem that it's been solved before, right? What kind of familiarity do we have with this, and what can we draw from as humans working together, and the experiences we have working with other organizations and other companies too.
Earlier you mentioned that you may have, I don't want to speak for you, but I thought you said you may have worked with or been familiar with a company that has kept humanity front and center. Is that correct?
I've come across a few, right?
Okay. What are the key differences between those companies and companies that aren't human-centered?
So I think that's easiest to answer through stories, right? So around the time that the pandemic was unfolding, I was working with a data analytics firm, and they had been working over the last year to really roll out a pretty big organizational change, right? They wanted to organize themselves to be more adaptive and more agile. They had they wanted to have multiple teams of people working together cross-functionally. And so they'd been working, they'd done, pilots and tests and rolled it out in some places and experimented a lot. And they were kind of finally ready to make the big shifts. And they were going to be changing who reported to who, what their HR structure was, to align with the way that they'd really been working in a lot of ways for the last year. And they were planning to roll all of that out in the spring of 2020. And of course, in the spring of 2020, the pandemic hit and everybody started working from home. They'd been an entirely on-site company up until this point. And so that group of people, as many did, suddenly had a huge new emerging change that they had to respond to. And over the course of a few weeks, I was working with their executive team. And at one point, one of the leaders asked, her question was, I know that people have a lot going on at home. What percentage of capacity should I expect to have people need for like home life? And like, what percentage of capacity do you think is reasonable to expect that people spend at work? I want to be realistic and I want to have realistic understanding. And that question wasn't a very human question, right? Because we're not percentages of capacity. We're just whole people, and it's kind of impossible to say what percentage of our capacity was going to go to figuring out how to work with kids at home and all the many things that were happening. But over the course of that, we had that conversation. We talked about what that meant, right? And what people were experiencing. And ultimately, what this organization decided to do, which I thought was very human, was recognize that everybody was maxed in their capacity for change. And sometimes it's helpful to think about we change in progress limits, or that we all have a certain amount of change capital that we can spend, and it's limited. It's renewable, but it's limited. And so this leadership group recognized pretty quickly that everyone was really maxed with the amount of change that they were suddenly having to respond to. So they actually decided to delay their organizational restructure. So they started by saying, we're going to just hold off for 6 months. Maybe now isn't the right time to change who everybody reports to and who the hiring managers are and the structures of our departments right now, while we're also trying to figure out how to work from home, how to collaborate remotely, how to respond to our kids being at home with us too. And so they just hit pause. They like took that whole big change initiative right out of the in progress queue, and they set it on the shelf, and they continued to work forward towards their emerging goals, which wound up being quite different than what they had been the previous few weeks. And then 6 months later, they revisited it, and they decided that they were still responding to a lot of emerging change. The nature of their business had really shifted over the last 6 months. And so they delayed that HR restructure for another couple of months, and then they were ready for it. And collectively, they checked in as a group, not just with the executive leadership team, but they were doing these pulse checks with the entire organization, because everyone knew this change was coming. And so as they were making decisions about when was the right time to make that really big shift, they were getting a lot of input from their teams and from their employees. And so by the time they did decide that they were ready for that shift, it was a collective decision they got to make. And I was really impressed, because I think it's really, really hard to put something in pause or to limit work in progress, and to say like, maybe now isn't exactly the right time for us to be so cause so much disruption, because we've just, had the equivalent of 50 soccer balls thrown at us, and we're trying to navigate. That's one example that jumps out to me and has really stuck with me, about recognizing just we're humans. And even though everything is important, there's just still a limit to how much we can navigate at any one time.
Yeah, I think that's a very important key thing that I'm hearing you say is we do get change fatigue, and we do have a change capacity. And that was very great that they thought of that.
Yeah,
But
I think that's something that we can all too bring into our organizations, to that question of like, where do we want to spend our change capital when we think about organizational change? If you think about each of us individually have some sort of change capacity, right? Sometimes I think about it as our change bucket. How full is it? And that's going to vary for each of us individually. It's not going to be the same for all of us, but collectively we bring that together and we have change capital to spend. And a lot of times I think organizationally, we don't think about how we're spending that change capital. And so we deplete it really fast, or we don't think about how to renew it. And then we get really frustrated that the change that we want to have happen isn't taking hold, or isn't happening, or people aren't responding, or they're not as excited about it as we think they ought to be.
That's a great idea. Do you have some other ideas or things that you've come across that you would like to share with us? Giving yourselves a change limit, right? That's awesome. Okay, what are some other things that you've come across that might be really good for organizations?
Yeah, I think understanding your change in progress limit is huge. I think the other thing that helps us be more human when we're responding to organizational change is recognizing that we all bring a set of values and experiences to what we think about change, right? And I think for those of us who are involved in, agile transformations or adopting new frameworks, right? Like LeSS around how we work together. We can often kind of assume that our values and beliefs around change are the norm, right? And if you get really excited about agility, sometimes you tend to be somebody who thinks that change brings learning and progress and it brings good things. And so of course we want to be learning and improving. But that's just one set of values around change. And if you think about change on a spectrum, or the ways that we think about change on a spectrum, on the one extreme is this idea that change brings progress. It's good. If you're a person who has generally benefited from change in your life, then you're going to feel a certain way about new opportunities, experimentation, trying different things. But on the other end of the spectrum is the belief that stability creates rhythm and routine and relationships, and that change disrupts relationships and routines and rituals. And that's an equally valid value to hold, or cultural belief to have. And they kind of wind up existing on opposite ends of the spectrum. They don't have to, but they often do. And we don't often recognize that in our own transformation work, we're upholding a set of values and preferences around our beliefs around change that may not be shared widely by everybody, or may not be coming from the same place that everybody brings, their perspective around change. And I think that's something that we often miss when it comes to leading organizational change or leading transformation activities. A few years ago, I was, it's been more than a few years now, about a decade ago, I was working with an organization that was going through an agile transformation, and they were actually introducing and adopting LeSS as their large-scale Scrum framework. And a lot of people were super excited about it. And there was this manager, as I was getting to know the organization, that I'd been told by several people was a change resistor. And she was kind of holding everybody back. And she was really not supportive. And could I work with her and coach her to help her get on board? And I started getting to know her, right? And under just building trust and coaching her. And she very much had a lot of questions. She wasn't on board with everything that was happening. And after a few months of working together, she shared with me at the end of a strategy day, everybody was on site and we were walking out. And what she shared with me was, she said, it's not that I don't like change, or it's not that I don't think that this is going to work. She said, but I'm really sad about losing my team. And she was a functional manager. She'd been leading a group of people who all had the same role in the company, and that was shifting and changing. She said, I'm really sad about that because I've worked really hard to build a team of people that trust each other and that collaborate well together. And then she went on to share very personally that as she was a kid growing up, she grew up in a foster care setting, and she had to move a lot. And every change that she experienced meant loss of relationships and loss of disruption. And that as she was experiencing all of this, those were the feelings that were coming up for her. And so it wasn't that she wasn't committed to the outcome, it was that she was really grieving losing the team that she had built. And when I heard her tell that story and I heard her reflect on that, I think light bulbs went off for me in a really significant way, recognizing that I get really excited about change. And that doesn't make me right. And she was really feeling the loss of relationships around this change, and that doesn't make her wrong. And that there's room for both. And just recognizing, I think just both in our humanity, like how we operate, we also bring our culture and our values and our beliefs and our preferences to the work that we do. And that rarely gets accounted for in organizational change initiatives, right? When we start talking about structure and policy and HR. And yet that's the thing that we all get to start with, just who we are, our experiences, our beliefs, and our values. And that's how we show up.
Great. I actually want to invite everybody to answer a couple of questions in the chat. You can answer one of these two questions or both, it doesn't matter. Can you share with us in the chat something you personally or something you observed someone else around their resistance or fear to change, like Brandi just shared with us? Do any of us have any experience of picking this up on someone else or having it for ourselves? That was question number one. And then question number two actually might need to wait, but we'll do it anyway. Can anybody give an example of a terrible idea around change that got executed and how it had a negative impact on people, where they totally just overlooked the human factor? So let's just throw this out there. Let's just start throwing some of that juicy stuff out there, right? you don't have to put who you worked with. So the two questions are, for yourself or someone that you got to talk to, you got to learn what their resistance or reason why the change was there. And the other one is, did you experience and witness a really poor decision around implementing change, and what was that? And I have no idea if anybody's typing. I'm going to hope that at least one of you type something.
Jerry, am I allowed to ask follow-up question to what people are putting in the chat?
Yeah, that's kind of the energy behind this.
Okay, good. Because I'm curious, Bill, if you wouldn't mind sharing what you think about, right? And helping is not even the word I want to use, like acknowledging that grief and that shift, and how to respond to like that PO who's sad, right? That they're going to lose their team. Like, what are some of the ways that you engage or interact with that person?
Yeah. So one thing, it was funny because he came to me, which was pretty cool. And I am, so understand my role is, so I am the director of about, I guess we're up to about 17 teams right now. So he's working with one of the 17 teams that are under me. And so, but he came to me about it because I'm also Captain Preachy Agile, right? As many of you know. And so I actually said, I get it. I said, but I think this is actually, one, career-wise, going to help you free up a little bit, right? You're now no longer going to be the backlog manager. You're going to have that ability to influence multiple teams. And I go, and second, I don't know if it actually breaks that relationship per se. It eliminates the silo around it. So now you're going to engage with a couple others. So I tried to sell him more on the positive. But he had to kind of, I think, marinate in it, right? And I also actually was able to kind of give him a little bit of, he's a big Marty Kagan guy, love Kagan. And so I was like, well, maybe you should kind of go take a look there. I said it a little more gently. I can't remember the words, but I basically said, I think Marty has some really cool thoughts on this too, and you might want to dig into that. And he actually came back about 2 or 3 weeks later, and he was pretty energized and lit and excited. I get it. He's like, but it's scary. And I was like, totally get that. So.
I really appreciate like one of the first things that you said, Bill, like that trust that exists, right? And I think like when we think about change at scale, like maybe there's multiple product owners experiencing a similar shift, or a lot of people being asked to like exist in different roles. A lot of times when we sense that resistance, we want to counter it with like facts, right? Or more presentations or more information. And that in our physical bodies just like puts up our alarms, right? Because the goal isn't really to like trick somebody into the change or to convince them even, right? It's to build shared understanding, build trust that we can experiment forward, right? And move forward together, and how important that is. And like, there's no amount of slideshows or presentations that's necessarily going to convince somebody that something that they're skeptical of is going to be okay. It's that trust that you have built, right? And if we don't have that trust in place, most organizational change efforts aren't effective, right? And they fail. So I really appreciate that.
I'm reading Rebecca's. She worked with a person that struggles and wanting to know absolutely everything that happens on this team. Sometimes we kind of know this person, right? Every change, big, little, doesn't matter. My team, I want in.
Yeah. Right. So like that, I start to think about that, Rebecca, and think, is that we use the word change and it means a lot of different things, right? So the person who's like, I want to know about every change on the team. What do they actually mean when they say that? Right. And when they use that word change, like, are they really talking about, shifts in how we work together? They want all of the information. They want all the data, what motivates them. Like I get lots of curious questions about what they're actually looking for. And are we using the right words to talk about what they need or they want? And is what they need and want as individuals, because this is the other reality. As an individual, as a human, I may not be convinced that the change that the organization is moving towards is right for me. I might have a lot of trusted relationships, but I still might not believe that what's coming next is going to be a good idea or is going to be good for the things that I care about or the things that I perceive I'm accountable for. And being human-centered in our change, even organizational change without losing our humanity, also means showing up with respect for that person and also boundaries, right? And limits, which may mean that what the organization needs and the direction the organization is going is no longer a good fit. And it's quite dehumanizing to think that if only we could just talk to you long enough, you'd be convinced to see it all my way, rather than acknowledge that perhaps you might get to a point where you need something different than the collective group needs. And that's okay to part ways. It doesn't make you a bad person. And that's key, right? It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a resistor to change. It doesn't make you a, stick in the mud. It just means that you need something different at this time, or you have a different value that you're operating out of, and that's okay. But we still may need to part ways, right? Because we still need to be aligned moving forward.
A good one. June, you put a couple out there. Which one would you like to speak to?
Sorry. Excuse me. I think just the change of when, mergers between two large organizations or two any size organizations, and what happens when there's one of the organizations, those longtime employees or employees who are very loyal and very proud of their identity, and that identity changes overnight. And we think that everybody's excited about that when people are really grieving and mourning that part of who they are and what they have been telling the world.
June, I wonder what you would want to see from organizational leaders when that starts to happen. What would you hope a leader who is very much keeping humanity at the center, what would you hope their response to that is?
Well, they handled this quite well. I think it's really to acknowledge that and to even allow for that grieving. Sometimes from a change perspective, we say, let's have a send off. Let's say farewell. Let's take some time to mark this. Let's think back and celebrate what we have accomplished, what this means to us and this identity before we sort of put on the new identity. But then also celebrating that. And this particular organization actually tied it and did a beautiful job with history and making the connection. It was a national organization. They really put a lot of time and effort into, what that new identity would mean and how it connected to to people's existing identities that they were letting go of. So there was a lot of pride that they built. They didn't take anything for granted, and they really looked at the storytelling and helping people be able to understand what is that new story that we're all going to tell now. It was really cool.
I really love that example. I really appreciate you sharing it, because I've worked with organizations who had that opportunity and felt like it would take too long, right? We don't have enough time for that. So that like celebration, that meaningful celebration that you mentioned, like they, really took time to understand the stories that had gotten everybody to the point that they were in the news story that they wanted to tell together. And I've worked with leaders who felt like they just didn't have time for that and they needed to move forward. And then, months and months later, we're scratching their heads wondering why people were still having such a hard time and struggling with what this was all about. And why won't people just get on board? And that investment in acknowledgement and like understanding where we're starting from and what we need to acknowledge, what we're losing, what's shifting, what that story is huge. And in the end, doesn't necessarily, it may take us longer in the beginning to build that foundation, but then we've got such a strong foundation from which to move forward from. And it makes such a huge difference. I think that's just a really humanizing story to share.
Yeah. And you know, the other thing I would just add, Brandi, is that we can't take for granted that people intuitively know this, because they may be dealing with their own soccer balls in any kind of a large, complex change. So we might think that they're all able to be at the top of their game and be doing exactly what they would do in a calm setting, but they themselves are dealing with many different soccer balls. And so that's, I just think, something we sometimes forget is how much leaders and managers and people managers in particular, just how much support they need, how much kind of nudges and reminders, because they can't do it all. So how can we make that path clear for them sometimes so that they can say, oh yes, that's exactly what I want to remember to do.
Yes, right. Because we only get our one whole human selves. And so whether, we can have boundaries between work and home, but we're just one whole human person. And that's what we get to bring into that change. And so it's never just isolated. I think that's the other thing about organizational change we forget is it doesn't happen in a silo, right? It's not isolated from all of the other dynamics that we're trying to wrestle with. Yeah, David, your quote that you shared in the chat, I think is really powerful, and it hits on this theme of acknowledgement. And Bill, you talked about it, and June, you talked about it. It's in a lot of the chat comments. And the thing about acknowledgement that I think is interesting as humans is we often get this message somewhere, probably because we've experienced it this way ourselves, that acknowledging something means agreeing with someone. And that if I acknowledge your experience as valid, or I ask you questions about it without saying but, that it means that I agree with you or that I think you're right. And I want to make sure that even if I acknowledge you might feel this way, I want to add my but. I want to make sure you understand me and my position first. And so we get caught up in that. It feels very hard to acknowledge somebody's experience and their perspective without justifying our own. Except that our human brains and our bodies are incredibly attuned to this. And so what happens when we experience that somebody's really just trying to defend their own position, right? And we don't experience true acknowledgement, is our defenses go up. Our nervous system becomes more activated. We listen differently. And we get into a defensive mode, right? Of trying to make sure I'm understood. So there's incredible power in just that acknowledgement, recognizing that acknowledgement doesn't mean agreeing. And many times we haven't experienced that ourselves. We don't have our own experiences acknowledged and validated. And so then it's hard to do that for others, but it becomes really, really important in the human experience of being able to process and engage with change.
There's a couple more comments out there about how people were impacted individually. Kyle got a job, showed up. Hey, just kidding. This is a new job. Derek is, hey, I needed to learn a new skill. I didn't really want to learn a skill, but then I learned a new skill, and hey, so the individual, when we talk about the organization, really the time it takes to build that confidence in each individual that it's okay to try something different. Whereas in Kyle, maybe it wasn't quite that okay. I don't know. How do we approach, we're talking about the teams, but how do you encourage leaders and people like yourselves and some, people in transformational roles to ensure that each person understands that the change is with them and they have permission to what?
Yeah, there's so many ways to bring humanity back into that change. And I would imagine that people in this group and conversation have heard and seen and experienced things that helped with that. I'd love to hear those thoughts in the chat too, right? Like what has made that work better? And I think, of course, it comes back to those very human fundamentals around having trust and communication and repetition, right? I think a lot of times we also give a reason for something changing once, and then we just trust that everybody heard that and internalized it. One thing that I saw with an organization that I worked with like midway kind of through the pandemic, Mayo Clinics, they were developing a center for digital health. And it's a plan that they had put in motion prior to the pandemic. And they thought that it would be like a long runway to get to the point where people were more comfortable with engaging with their care providers digitally. Well, turns out pandemic happened, and all of a sudden people got very comfortable with that because it was the only way to engage with their care providers. And so they went on turbo speed, and they were really reorganizing a lot of parts of the organization, bringing them together under the Center for Digital Health. And one of the things that they did that was so incredibly powerful was they had, they called them meetups. They were like every other Friday meetups with the chief digital officer. She showed up. They had a really effective way for people to generate questions and vote on which ones they wanted to have discussion around. And they just had very, very open dialogues on a very regular basis. And they did that for a whole year. And it created a direct line of communication between their leader and everybody who's working in the organization. And one of the things that I noticed over time, which to me was a sign that was very encouraging, was the first handful of sessions like this were kind of timid. Like, there were definitely some people who asked super hardball questions and really brought their questions, but there weren't a lot of questions. And there wasn't a lot of engagement. And at one point, somebody suggested maybe we don't need to keep doing these. Like, not tons of people are always coming and we're not getting the kind of engagement that we want. But this leader really persisted. She said it's really important that we keep showing up. Even if other people aren't showing up the way that we think they should, I need to show up. And she did. And over time, over a couple of months, more people started coming. The questions continued to be challenging questions, but they weren't aggressive questions in the same way that they were initially, kind of. And they really reflected a shift in being more honest and open. And I think that continued presence and persistence was just one way that she continued to communicate that she was committed to building trust and committed to taking questions away. She didn't answer every question. Sometimes she said, I want to think about that. And she would come back to the next conversation, or she would follow up with an actual answer. And so she just persistently showed up, and it really built a lot of trust over time.
So I just want to kind of bring us back full circle. So we're talking about organizational change and the humanity side of it. And we're really talking a lot about how, if we're not paying attention to the human being, we can really screw things up. It can be a really, not so good outcome. And I think a lot of us have some experience with that. And so when you think about the human brain, what is one or two things you want us all to remember every time we're trying to talk about change with another human being? What's happening that we should have awareness around?
Right. So many things are happening in our brains and in our bodies around how we react to what we perceive as change. I think one of the things to keep in mind is humans are incredibly good at change. I think in these conversations around organizational change, we can develop this like narrative and story that people don't like change and they're not very good at change, and everybody would just like to keep things the way that they are. And that's a myth, even about our like bodies and our nervous systems. Like, there is an element in our bodies that we want to maintain homeostasis, and we want to maintain what feels safe and stable. But it's a myth that humans don't want to change, or that we would prefer things to stay the way they are. Humans are incredibly adaptive and incredibly good at change. We just manage it in particular ways. And so one of those things we've already talked about, right? It's this idea that we have change capital, and humans are incredibly good at adapting and changing, solving problems together, but we only have so much change capital. it is a limited resource. It is not unending and expansive. It's renewable. We can renew our change capital, but it is limited. And so when something, gosh, like recently I was working with an organization, and June, you'll appreciate this because I think you've had some familiarity with it. New tool was rolled out, and the tool was meant to help everybody manage their backlogs more easily and have more visibility and transparency. But I've never been in so many conversations where I've experienced people like crying about the experience of having this tool roll out, the stress that it caused. And the thing is, it wasn't that the tool was so overwhelming and so stressful. It was that many of the people involved, their change capital was spent. Their capacity for change was maxed out. And adding in this new tool just caused things to overflow, right? And so it's understanding that we do have this capacity for change that is limited, and we have to find ways that help us to renew our capacity for change. And the other thing that I think is really important, and this is something that I learned in a lot of the research that I've done that's gone into the book, is about what's actually happening in our brains, right, when we're managing change. And the thing about managing and responding to change is it's part of this collection of activities that our brain does called executive functions. Executive functions are all the questions that we ask, like, what's the goal and what am I doing right now? And who's around me? And what are the rules of engaging with these people around me? And executive function is what we do when we're doing analysis or brainstorming or communication management, deciding what to say in response to somebody else. One of the things that it's an executive function task that all of us do all day long is context switching. And context switching is what happens, right, when we're going from one topic to another, one meeting to another, or when we're dividing our capacity across multiple priorities. Our brain is constantly engaged in this like swirl of context switching, changing what's the goal here and who are the people here, and what's the goal here and now who are the people here, and our brain's doing this nonstop. Our brains can only do one executive function at a time. So while we can rotate through those tasks really quickly, we can only do one task at a time. Why this is really important is because one of the other things that's an executive function task is perspective shifting and mindset shifting. That's our ability to look at something from a different direction, right? To use a different lens to see the problem differently. And because it's an executive function, we literally can't shift our perspective or shift our mindset at the same time that we are context switching. So if you're part of an organization that has an abundance of important work to do, and you're trying to change how you work together, you are likely flooded with meetings and projects and competing priorities, and your brain is masterfully managing all of that. But it comes with a really big cost. And it is incredibly difficult for our brains and our bodies to adopt a different perspective while we are managing all of that context switching. And I think that is one of the things that we miss a lot of times, right? It impacts our change capital. So the more context switching, the more competing priorities we're managing, the more limited our change capital is. And so when we are struggling with making organizational shifts and changes, and we're not keeping that in context with all of the other competing priorities that we're trying to juggle, we just run out of bandwidth to do that. And it doesn't matter how important the change is, how much we want it, how well thought out it was. If we don't have the capacity to learn about it and adopt a different perspective around it, it'll never happen.
Well, that's great insight. Thank you very much for that. So I want to open it up to free fall questions. So now you can type them, or you can just come off mute and ask any question you want. I did want to ask a funny question earlier today, and what is humanity? But while you're answering that,
you have to answer it. No, Jerry, you have to answer your own question.
You want me to answer it?
Yeah, I want you to answer your own question.
Humanity.
What's humanity?
The quality of our human connection.
Quality over human connection. I love that. That's way better than the answer I would have given, but now I'll adapt it, right? It's our capacity for connection with one another, I think, is what makes us human too.
Thank you. Right, good. And I did not have that. It just came right out, right on the spot.
I love
All
it.
right. So, David, you had a question, and then let's popcorn this. Everybody, jump in there and ask your question. Dave, what's your question?
Sure. So I love the concept of change capital. Is there a way that you go about measuring that? Surveys? I don't know.
Yeah. One really practical way to measure it, it's not a scientifically valid way to measure it, but I think it's really useful. Especially if you're checking in on yourself, I think we intuitively just kind of understand, like, where am I at? How full is my change bucket? But I've also done this with teams where I just ask them to give a fist to 5 kind of assessment, like how spent is your change capital, right? You could ask that in terms of how much change capital do you have, right? Capacity for new things or for change. Or sometimes I ask, how full is your change bucket, right? And a fist to 5 check-in with a team is really useful, especially as you're contemplating, if you lead teams, as you're contemplating introducing something new, right? If everybody's change buckets at 4 and 5, it doesn't matter whether it's from work or home. You don't have to ask people to, share their deeply personal reasons for that, but you get this pulse check, and that might give you some indication about what capacity people have to try something different or to make a shift. I've also done that where it's more of an anonymous survey, because the thing about change capital is it doesn't really matter how I define it for you, right, David? Like, you're the boss of your own change capital. You're the only one who actually can define what that means for yourself. And it's absolutely okay that we define it differently because we experience it differently. So asking and checking in often is incredibly useful.
That's good. Thank you. I think there's another question.
This is June. I'll ask another question if I can.
Yeah.
So Brandi, how do you guide leaders in thinking about this? Like leaders at the highest level to really understand, change capital, the capacity of their people to deal with another soccer ball. Like what's your approach to help increase that awareness amongst that audience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, the answer depends, right, on what the particular circumstances are. But I think one thing that can be really helpful is framing it up as part of our work in progress, right? And understanding what are the big goals. However, what if we're talking about, leadership level and we're looking at a whole organization, understanding what we're trying to make progress on, and keeping an open container for what the changes that we're trying to do, and to help to quantify that, right? So the other thing that leaders who are higher up in an organization can get pretty distanced from is what's actually required to make these changes. So one of the things that can be really helpful is to spell that out more, invite them to spell it out more. What's actually going into this? What are we actually asking people to shift? And start to name that out more concretely. And when you start to do that, it starts to, right, you start to understand and expand why that maybe is so demanding. And so building more empathy with leaders and helping them articulate what they're actually asking for, what's actually changing, I think goes a long way. If it's in one-on-one conversations, I think there's a huge role in acknowledging that leaders are also experiencing this too, right? There's a tremendous amount of pressure. And the other thing that I find to be really helpful is to emphasize the question of how long do we want this to take? Right? It's not about just rushing through change, but it's also saying what's possible when we've moved forward, not when we've reached the destination, but if we solved this problem, right? If our teams were organized differently, or if our teams were organized differently, if we shifted the way that we make decisions in this way, what would be possible next? And then one thing that can be super helpful as you're talking about that is talking about the opportunity cost of not moving forward or of not creating the right space for change, right? So understanding what's possible once we move forward, and what's the opportunity cost of letting this drag out and take a really long time. And then I back all the way up to it's not about having a slow start. It's about building a strong foundation, right? And building a strong foundation so that we can adapt to whatever else is going to come along the way. And it's much less about having the master plan and checking off the boxes that we've arrived. Those are some things that I think help leaders understand and connect more to maybe what people are experiencing when big change is happening.
I'd like to invite maybe 2 more questions, and then we have a special little activity that David's going to lead us through at the end here. Someone who hasn't asked a question yet, maybe you've been a little shy. If you got one, go ahead and throw it out there. If not, Sam, I see you put one in the chat. You can definitely ask that one if no one else steps up. All right, Sam, you're it.
Yeah.
All right. I'll put it out there.
Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, so I when we were preparing, I downloaded the free guide that you've got on the little book landing page, and I've been working through it, and really great right off if people want
Lead a team that no one wants to leave. Is that the right? Is that the one? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And one of the things that you mentioned is this suggestion. I think this was from a Liberating Structures workshop, which I've used a number of them, really like the resource. So I'd love to hear your experience in terms of that get 15% better activity that you mentioned in the guide.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this is actually a great question to wrap up on because it's absolutely a tool that we can use in this conversation around organizational change. So the idea behind 15% solutions, and Sam's right, it comes from a Liberating Structure activity. And you can get more information about that if you want. You can Google it, or you can go to my website and you can download Lead a Team That No One Wants to Leave, and I'll tell you more about it there. But the idea is that when we're facing a big problem, like a big organizational change, or being really specific, right, with the group that's here, something big like a LeSS adoption, right, large scale Scrum, or name any other big complex challenge, right, that you're trying to understand how to change is always going to be inherently involved there, right? So when we're dealing with big challenges and big problems, oftentimes we get focused on like the 100% solution. How will we know we have solved this problem? And that's a really good question to ask, but it can start to very quickly feel overwhelming in terms of where do we go from here? And focusing on the big solution can oftentimes get us into the cycle where we wind up making big plans. We spend a lot of time analyzing and planning and architecting. I don't know if that's an actual word. I think it is. Designing, right? Big plans and change processes, or you name it, right? Big ways to solve the problem. And that can really immobilize us, because those big things are really hard to figure out. You might even be thinking about this whole entire conversation and be thinking, this all sounds nice, but I'm not the one in my organization who's saying we need to change in this way, or we need to restructure ourselves. I'm not the one calling the shots. What do I even do about it? It might feel like it's hard to know where to take action. So the idea of 15% solutions is this question. It says, what if you could solve the problem 15% of the way? What if it could just get 15% better? What might that take? And that immediately shrinks us to a very narrow opportunity to find a next step forward. And the reason that that's so powerful is because taking action is the only way we learn about what's going to work better. And so while we might have a big understanding of like the big goals that we're after, if we can focus on what might it take to solve this problem and make it 15% better, our mindset shifts and our brain shifts, right? And we unlock a lot of small actions that may otherwise have gone overlooked, or been overlooked, right? Because they don't seem significant enough, or they don't seem like they're going to make a big difference, or it's only going to, not going to really move the needle. But the thing about human ecosystems, of which we are all part of, the thing about human ecosystems and human organizations is that small actions many times can have an outsized impact. We just don't always know which small actions are going to have the outsized impact, but small actions can be the thing that unlocks the next better step. And so finding ways to make a 15% improvement just changes the way our brain approaches the problem and the way we interact. There's two other things that go along with 15% solutions criteria. A 15% solution counts as a 15% solution if you are entirely empowered to take action on it today, right? So you don't need permission from somebody to take action. And if all the people needed to take action are in the conversation and can agree to it. If those two things aren't true, it might be a very great idea, definitely worth pursuing, but it's not a 15% solution because you won't be able to take action on it right away. And I think that when it comes to leading and navigating change, those 15% solutions, those small next better steps are absolutely the things that can unlock new possibilities, help us learn faster how to be more effective and what's actually working, and can get us into action. It doesn't mean that's the only way we tackle something big like an organizational transformation, but it is something that we can do well and in tandem with, looking at the bigger picture. So that's where 15% solutions come in. I think they're super powerful, and they really shift how our brain engages and how we engage with each other when it comes to problem solving.
Nice. Great way to end the conversation. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. People, don't hang up just yet. David's got a free giveaway. Brandi has been so kind as to have a bunch of things that she's going to give away to everybody. But before we do that, I just want to say thank you everyone for being here. Great questions, great conversation. Keep following our meetup group so that you can find out when our next session is and what the topic will be. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and then David, we're going to pass it over to you. What you got, David?
All right. And maybe Brandi, do you want to talk about what the freebies are?
I do.